One evening, I was out in Lacey, WA, planning to pick up a handgun I'd recently purchased for personal protection. Despite the pickup status being marked ready, both online and in the email I'd received, the store informed me it wasn't in stock yet and told me to come back in another week. Frustrated, I debated my next move. I lived about an hour away, and with evening rush hour ramping up, the idea of sitting in traffic for an extra hour was anything but appealing. Side note, the car I was driving wasn't even mine. It belonged to my dad. I'd been borrowing it ever since my trusty old Honda broke down the year before. I was still saving up for a replacement. To kill time, I wandered around the store for a while, then decided to head to a nearby coffee shop. It was a newly built cabin-style cafe with a modern touch. After ordering a 16-O's dirty chai, I stepped back out into the overcast evening, drink in hand, and got into my car. Still not ready to face the traffic, I drove to a gas station just around the corner. The car didn't need gas, so I parked in a spot near the corner of a four-way intersection where the station was located. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and lit a cigarette, leaning against the driver's side door to avoid stinking up the interior. The weather was typical for late autumn, drizzly and overcast, but it wasn't too cold. Dusk was settling in, and most of the daylight had faded. The mist softened the glow of the traffic lights at the intersection, casting an eerie ambiance as they shifted from green to yellow to red. Lost in thought, sipping my coffee and zoning out to the rhythm of the stoplights. I didn't notice him at first. A man was crossing the street toward me. He was white, average height, with unkempt strawberry blonde hair and an awkward limp. His clothes looked like they hadn't been changed in days, and he carried a worn-out backpack that seemed to contain all his belongings. He didn't smell, but his appearance screamed hard living. Probably drugs, I thought. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but growing up in the suburbs of Seattle had taught me to be cautious. By the time I noticed him, he was already halfway across the street, heading directly toward me. He made eye contact, his face twisted into a winced grin. Uneasy, I instinctively locked the car doors, but stayed where I was, leaning casually against the car and finishing my cigarette. I'm not the kind of person to strike up random conversations, but I also don't go out of my way to be rude. The man stopped about 10 feet away and greeted me with a simple, "Hello." Then he asked if I had a light. Hesitant, but not seeing any harm in his request, I complied, holding out my lighter for him. Taking 2 cautious steps forward, I held out my lighter to meet the cigarette he was holding, lighting it for him as he edged closer. He mumbled a quick thanks and then launched into small talk. His words were awkward, disjointed, and clearly aimed at pulling on my sympathies. He mentioned getting off the bus a few minutes ago and needing to go just 1 block further down the road. Then, mid-sentence, he stopped like he'd just had an epiphany, a bad actor in a cheap play. "Hey," he said, his voice suddenly brightening. "Would you mind just dropping me off down the road? It's not very far." I instantly felt a knot in my stomach. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound firm but polite. "I can't. This is my dad's car, and I'm not comfortable driving anyone without his permission." It was complete nonsense. A flimsy excuse I pulled out on the spot, but it felt believable enough. His smile immediately dropped, flattening into a tense, joyless line. His demeanor shifted in an instant. He pressed on, his voice rising slightly in pitch and insistence. "It's just down the road," he whined, his tone now bordering on anger. "My leg is killing me, and it's not even far for you. I'll give you a cigarette." That burst of hostility sent a chill up my spine. I could feel my fight or flight instinct kicking in as I looked for a way to defuse the situation. Keeping my voice steady, I repeated, "I'm sorry, but I can't help you. It's my dad's car, and he has set rules. Still absolute BS, but I needed a way to shut this down." Drawing from years of hospitality experience, I tried to redirect his frustration with some alternative suggestions. "Maybe someone inside the gas station can help you out," I said. "Or you could call for a ride. It might be easier." With each word, I could see his irritation building. His hands balled into fists, not in a directly threatening way, but like a toddler about to throw a tantrum for not getting what they wanted. He stared at me, his eyes scanning me from head to toe, as though he were sizing me up. That moment of pause made my skin crawl. I'm not physically intimidating. I'm small, and I knew I wouldn't stand a chance if things escalated. Trying to stay calm, I forced a polite smile, said, "I hope you make it home safely," and quickly unlocked my car. In one fluid motion, I jumped inside and locked the doors behind me. When I looked up, I saw him already walking away. No, speed walking, back across the street in the direction he'd originally come from. The limp? Gone. The awkward gait? Gone. There was no sign of pain or distress at all. Instead, his movements were deliberate and rageful. He looked like a completely different person, and that realization sent a shiver down my spine. I sat there for a moment, heart racing, as the weight of what had just happened sank in. I'd dodged a bullet. I felt stupid for lingering alone in the city after dark, but at least I'd made the right call to get out of the situation. Without a second thought, I started the car and drove home. Traffic or no traffic. The hour and 45 minutes it took to get back didn't bother me one bit. Every inconvenience along the way was worth it for the sheer relief of being away from that man. If you haven't heard it enough already, be careful who you give your attention to, especially when you're alone. People aren't always what they seem, and a harmless stranger can turn unsettling fast. Stay alert, trust your gut, and err on the side of caution. It could make all the difference. At the time of this story, I was 14. Along with being young, I struggled with crippling anxiety and depression. One thing about me, though, is that I've always been hyper-vigilant about my surroundings, a habit that stuck with me to this day. This particular night, I was staying over at a friend's house for the first time. Usually she stayed at mine, so I wasn't familiar with her place. To help you understand what happened, I need to describe the house and its strange setup. Her home was on a sloped hill, and as you drove down the steep road, the first thing you'd see was a big, expansive structure. It looked like an old mansion. If you kept going, you'd come to two smaller, run-down buildings. One was just a bedroom, and the other was slightly larger, with a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a small bathroom. These two sections were semi-separated, with no internal doors, just beads or cloth separating the bathroom from the kitchen. My friend's room was in the standalone bedroom, while her mom lived in the section with the kitchen and bathroom. The landlord of the property lived in the mansion at the top of the hill. Surrounding all of this, dense, untouched Australian rainforest. When I say dense, I mean dense. If you tried walking through, you'd be lucky to avoid bites, from spiders, ants, leeches, or who knows what else. The first strange thing happened in the afternoon. My friend and I walked into her mom's flat for something. I can't quite remember what. Maybe we were hungry, or trying to figure out how to get reception. Spoiler, there wasn't any. As we called out for her mum, we heard a reply. "Yeah," coming from outside. I froze, exchanging a confused look with my friend. Her mum was supposed to be in the bathroom right in front of us. So why did we hear a man's voice outside? We were both unsettled, but not wanting to scare ourselves. We brushed it off and went back to having fun in her room. For more context, her room was a bit unusual. Half of it was used as storage by the landlord, with the back section blocked off by a tall shelf and a divider. There was a large glass sliding door at the front of the room, and another door in the blocked-off back section. You couldn't access that back door unless you squeezed through a tight space outside. Fast forward to nighttime. At some point, we needed to use the bathroom, so we left her room and walked over to her mum's flat. Her mum was fast asleep, so we used the bathroom as quietly as possible before heading back. On the short walk back to her room, we both stopped dead in our tracks. In the woods, just beyond the clearing, we saw them. A pair of eyes staring straight at us from behind a tree. Panic set in instantly. My heart was pounding as I froze, unsure what to do. Gripping my phone, I pulled it out and snapped a photo. Then, without a word, we sprinted back to her room, locked the glass sliding door, and yanked the curtain shut. We were already shaking when we looked at the photo. When I brightened the image, our fears were confirmed. There, in the dark woods, was what appeared to be a man staring directly at us from behind the tree. Terrified, I called my mum, who was about an hour away. She dismissed it, trying to reassure me that we were just scaring ourselves. Her words helped a little, but even with that slight comfort, the fear didn't fade. We were still scared out of our minds. After a while, we managed to calm down and convinced ourselves that it must have been our imaginations playing tricks on us. Trying to distract ourselves, we pulled out my laptop and put on a cheesy rom-com. I don't even remember the name of the movie. It was just something lighthearted to take our minds off the fear. Maybe 20 or 30 minutes into the movie, we both froze. We paused the laptop. Footsteps. Crunching footsteps echoed on the dry leaves just outside her room. My heart raced as we sat motionless, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, moving through the tight alleyway that led to the back door. In sheer terror, we climbed onto the bed as silently as we could, peeking over the room divider to get a view of the back door. We stared, holding our breath, as the room fell into a haunting silence. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster. Whoever it was, they were trying to get inside. Thankfully, the door couldn't be opened. It was jammed shut by storage items blocking it. But the rattling stopped just as abruptly as it started. No more noise. We clung to each other, crying silently, desperate not to make a sound. Then, the footsteps resumed, crunching leaves again as they moved away from the back door. But this time, they were heading toward the front of the room. We didn't hesitate anymore. I grabbed my phone and called the police. Through panicked tears, we tried to explain what was happening to the operator on the other end. She told us to stay put and reassured us that a unit was being dispatched. Then, just as we were starting to think we were safe, we heard it. A phone ringing. It was coming from the landlord's mansion. The sound was harsh, like an old landline phone. It rang loudly, filling the tense silence, and dragged on for what felt like an eternity before stopping. Then, we heard his voice. The landlord was talking to someone, presumably the operator. That's when we noticed something else that made our blood run cold. Fingerprints. On her window, there were fresh handprints that hadn't been there earlier. The windows in her room were slatted glass, the kind you can open and shut with a lever. Whoever left the prints had reached up, cupped their hand around the glass, and dragged their fingers through the dust. Not long after, the landlord came down to her mother's unit, visibly upset. He told her the police had called him, and that he made sure they didn't send a unit. His tone was clipped, as though we were the ones inconveniencing him. Her mother came to her room, and we tried to explain everything. The footsteps, the rattling doorknob, the handprints. But neither the landlord nor her mother seemed particularly concerned. Their indifference left us feeling shaken and completely unsafe. I couldn't stay the night. Neither could my friend. We were too terrified to spend another minute there. I called my mom, and she drove out to pick us up around 11 p.m. or midnight. The next day, when we dropped my friend back at her house, her mother shared something that sent another chill down my spine. Next to her mother's unit, there had been a sturdy pole holding beads and fairy lights. It wasn't just freestanding. It was embedded into the cement and secured with zip ties to other objects. Yet, sometime during the night after we left, the pole had been knocked down. It had been raining that night, with some wind, but nothing strong enough to bring down something that firmly fixed. It didn't make sense. To this day, I don't know what to make of everything that happened. Was it her landlord? Or maybe her ex-stepfather, who we knew was unhinged? I still don't have an answer. But one thing is for sure. That night was far from normal. This story took place about 3 years ago during the summer of 2012. It's never been easy for me to talk about, but writing about it has helped me process everything. I was 17 at the time and had just landed my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia, in a small mountain community where everything felt secluded. My mom's friend owned a camping resort nearby with a general store, and she hired me to help out during the busy summer months. It was a simple enough job, and I liked meeting new people, especially since our isolated community didn't offer many chances to interact with others. One day, a big, burly man came into the store. He looked like he belonged in the mountains, mid-40s to early 50s, towering at 6'5", and easily 280 pounds. His clothes were worn and dirty, his long beard unkempt, and his overall appearance screamed hermit. We had our share of reclusive types in the area, and he fit the bill perfectly. He browsed for a bit, and eventually came up to the register with a few basic items, including one of the store's homemade bars of soap. As I rang up his purchase, he stood there, staring at me without a word. The silence felt like it stretched on forever. Finally, he broke it. "Did you make this soap?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. "Possibly," I said, keeping my tone polite. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" he asked. "Toiletries and things like that, yeah," I replied cautiously. "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I didn't know how to respond. I finished ringing up his items as quickly as I could, but before he left, he asked, "You cook too?" "Sometimes," I replied, unsure where this was going. "Bet the boys around here are itching to marry you," he said with a strange smile. I stood there, speechless, wondering what on earth I'd said that gave him the impression I was wife material. Later, I told Krista, my mom's friend and boss, about the odd encounter, and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends when I mentioned it. But Mountain Man didn't go away. He started showing up at the store more often. At first, our conversations were brief, but over time, they became more unsettling. He told me about his cabin in the woods, proudly claiming he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, only coming to the store for a few essentials. Then his comments became personal. He started making remarks about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around, someone who could cook his kills and make soap. One time, he even said I had the birthin' hips that men lust after. The words sent a shiver down my spine. His behavior became increasingly intrusive. He invited me to go fishing, hunting, or to see his cabin. Offers I always declined as politely as I could, but he grew more insistent, and his intensity made me feel unsafe. I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was making me, and she immediately offered a solution. Whenever he came into the store, I was to fetch her, and she would handle his transactions. Her intervention helped. I stopped interacting with him directly, and for a while, I thought the problem was solved. But one night, I was closing the store alone. Krista had left about an hour earlier, and it was late, around 10 p.m. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only 2 vehicles, my car and an old blue pickup. My stomach dropped. I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup. I scanned the lot, but didn't see him. Hoping he wasn't around, I walked quickly to my car, my eyes darting around nervously. Before getting in, I checked the back seat, just to be sure, and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. I turned the key in the ignition, but instead of the engine starting, I got nothing but sputters. I tried again and again, panic setting in as the car refused to cooperate. Why tonight? Of all nights, why now? I thought, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone to call for help. Then it happened. A loud pounding on the driver's side window made me jump so hard I nearly screamed. My heart was in my throat, and I didn't want to look. I already knew who it was, but I did look, and there he was. Mountain Man grinned at me, his wide smile showcasing the gaps where his teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he called out loudly through the window, his voice booming in the silent night. I shook my head furiously, trying to mask the terror coursing through me. "My dad is on his way," I said firmly, hoping the lie would scare him off. The truth, I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. Mountain Man chuckled, a low, unsettling laugh that made my stomach churn. "No, he's not," he said. "Open the door." The hairs on my neck stood on end. How could he possibly know I was bluffing? "No," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "Leave me alone." His expression darkened, his grin replaced by a cold, angry scowl. Without a word, he grabbed the door handle and yanked on it furiously. But I'd locked the doors the moment I got inside. Frustrated, he began pounding on the window, each hit sending vibrations through the car. "Leave now, or I'm calling the cops," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. But he didn't stop. If anything, the pounding grew louder, more insistent. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my phone and dialed 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, but I didn't care. I just needed help. The pounding was so loud, I knew the dispatcher could hear it. She assured me that officers were on their way, but in this remote area, I knew it could take time. "The cops are on their way! Leave now!" I screamed at him, desperation dripping from every word. He paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked back toward his truck. Relief washed over me as I watched him go. Maybe he'd finally given up. But then he turned back around. And this time, he was holding a crowbar. "No!" I screamed, panic surging through me. "Get the fuck away from me!" He ignored me, striding up to the driver's side window and raising the crowbar high. With a sickening thud, he brought it down on the glass. I ducked down into the passenger seat, curling up on the floor and covering the back of my neck like they teach you in tornado drills. The sound of metal smashing against glass filled the car, each blow sending shards and cracks spidering across the window. I braced myself for the worst, but then I heard voices. Deep, authoritative shouts cutting through the chaos. "Get away from her!" someone yelled. I sat up cautiously and saw two men approaching. One of them was holding a shotgun, the barrel trained on Mountain Man. Relief swept over me like a wave. I recognized them as guests from the resort, likely there for a camping trip. They stood their ground, shouting at him to back off. Mountain Man froze, the crowbar lowering slightly. For the first time that night, he looked unsure of himself. I climbed out of the car, trembling, but thankful beyond words. "The police are on their way," I told the men, my voice shaking. They stayed with me until the cops arrived, keeping a watchful eye on Mountain Man, who surprisingly didn't try to run. When the police showed up, he didn't stand a chance. They arrested him on the spot, and I gave my statement, still shaking from the ordeal. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to real danger. Eventually, I learned more about Mountain Man. My cousin Luke, who's a cop, told me that the man had a long history of severe mental illness. He'd been in and out of state institutions and had been living alone in an old cabin deep in the woods. Apparently, he'd stopped taking his meds, and his condition had been deteriorating for a while. What chilled me the most was what the police found in his cabin. Among other things, they discovered a journal he kept. In it, he wrote extensively about feeling lonely and wanting a wife. Luke told me he mentioned me by name, thanks to the stupid name tag I wore at work. Luke didn't share all the details, but he said there were disturbing, lewd entries about me, along with a detailed plan to abduct me. It started with sabotaging my car to leave me vulnerable. When Luke told me that, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I nearly burst into tears, thinking about how differently that night could have gone if those two men hadn't come along. Thankfully, Mountain Man was sent back to a state institution. With any luck, he'll stay there for good.